have a bigger break, but if you don't behave now, you will not have a bigger break. We're taking time off our speakers. So we have the pleasure of having two speakers together, and we have Bryant Aybri and Rnata from the Institute of Community Integration at the University of Minnesota. And for those of you that were not there yesterday, you know, all of our things are always videotaped. I should let you know all of the things were videotaped if you haven't noticed, and they will be up on our Facebook. So if you weren't there yesterday, you're welcome. You will see the wonderful presentations from yesterday. Now we will be speaking about measuring quality and impact of home and community-based services for persons with disabilities, development and utilization of new measures. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. By the way, I'm Bryant, that's Rnata. And we are very pleased to be here to get a chance to share with you some of the work that we are doing at our Institute on Community Integration. We have within our institute a lot of different centers, and one of the centers is our Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Home and Community-based Services Outcome Measurement. This is research which is very different from the research that's been described so far today. But essentially a problem was brought to us, and we were asked if we could kind of apply our understanding of measurement, our understanding of assessment to help solve this problem. The problem we have is that we have a program called Home and Community-Based Services, which provides opportunities for people with disabilities who qualify for Medicaid services to receive services in their own home or in some type of supported living situation within the community. Our living situation within the community now, at least in Minnesota, typically are 2 or 3 people with disabilities living in a home within a community with the supports that they need. The supports could be somebody who is a home health aide coming into a home where an individual is living with a partner or a family member and providing very limited supports, or it could be much more significant supports being provided to somebody who has fairly significant support needs because of an intellectual and developmental disability. Now, the programs that fall under this home and community service-based label are really different. As I said, they range from minimal supports to quite intensive 24-hour, 7-day-a-week supports. And they're provided to people with a wide variety of different disabilities. Now, this program, Medicaid, which, by the way, is a program which, under our current administration, is under threat for having very intensive significant budget cuts, which is one of the reasons by measuring outcomes we think is important, basically is provided on a state-to-state basis. So, each state tends to administer the program a little bit differently. One of the things that really helped people with disabilities in the United States is that when the Affordable Care Act was passed by Congress a few years ago, it expanded the benefits to people with disabilities and really helped a lot of people with disabilities of different types, of different ages, get supports within the communities, living with their families, living with people of their choice, rather than being in more institutionalized. Now, to give you an idea of why it's important to measure the outcomes associated with these services, take a look at the amount of money that's spent in the United States, and this is, I think, a 2014 estimate on home and community-based services. $80.6 billion. That's a lot of money that the federal government is contributing to those services.
Sorry. What kind of services are you talking about? Health services or also?
I talked about that just a minute ago. It's home services and aids. It's services to support people who are living in the community who might need somebody to cook for them. Okay. In some cases, it's nursing services, or small living arrangements for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, personal care attendants. So it's really a wide variety of services for a wide variety of people with different types of disabilities, of different levels of support needs. Okay, it is not health services. That's one of the things that kind of is outside of the home and community-based service perspective. So again, a lot of money is being spent to provide services and supports to people so they live in the community. And there are a lot of different tools that have been developed over the years to measure the outcomes associated with home and community-based services. But there are some problems with those tools. You know, they focus on a whole bunch of different types of outcomes. Some focus primarily on the personal outcomes that people with disabilities experience. Others focus on what we call quality assurance measures. You know, they're not focused on people's personal outcomes, but, you know, are organizations who provide these services doing certain things for people that the people may or may not want? Because one of the problems with these tools is that they don't tend to be person-centered. Okay? The way these tools are administered differs by state. In some states, literally, a person comes into your home and they administer a survey to you. They ask you a set of questions, you know, question 1 followed by question 2, you know, and they might spend a half an hour to an hour to an hour and a half with you, asking you to provide them with information about how you're experiencing life and the quality of services you're receiving. And it really is a pretty much kind of by format set of questions and answers. In other states, the programs are administered very differently, or these assessments, and a person will come in who has a much higher level of training as an interviewer, and will have a conversation with you. You know, and that conversation will try to get at what's important to you, how you are kind of experiencing life, and then they will then go back and fill out kind of these questions to try to provide that same information to the individuals who kind of are supporting, funding these programs and administering these programs. The idea here is that, you know, if we really want to understand the experiences of people with disabilities and whether the funding we're providing for home and community-based services is being well spent, we have to ask people what their experiences are when they're receiving these services. You know, are these experiences allowing them to really achieve desired life outcomes? You know, are these experiences supporting them to be of the community rather than just to be physically present within the community? And very important to both Rnata and me and the people who we are working with is, are these experiences really allowing them to achieve in life what's important to them as opposed to what others think is important for them? So we really are trying to focus on developing measurement systems which focus on things in a very person-centered way. Right now, that is not what our measurement systems look like. Okay, even the best measurement systems that we have, okay, tend to not be person-centered. They tend to focus on things which, quote, experts think is important for people with disabilities to experience. And they're administered in so many different ways that it's almost impossible for us to understand whether there are differences in the outcomes experiences by people with disabilities who live in different states, whether there are differences in outcomes experienced by people who have different types of disabilities who may be receiving any of these wide variety of services, including a combination of these services. So, you know, what I'd like you to do is, just for a minute, you know, put yourself in the shoes of somebody in each of the following roles. Because these are all individuals who are, I would call them stakeholders in the system of supports. You know, a person with a disability, a family member with a person with a disability, somebody who provides these types of services, and somebody who administers these types of programs at a state level or sometimes at a federal level. For each of these stakeholder groups, you know, think about what you believe would be the most important outcomes to measure associated with people receiving these home and community-based services. Think about what issues or problems you would want, you know, these tools and the data collected to be able to address. I mean, because it makes no sense to just go out and collect data. We need to use this data in a certain way. And then, what characteristics would you want these tools, these measures, to have? Such as not take more than a half an hour to administer, be easy to administer? Or most important to Rnata and I, are they providing us with a valid and reliable estimate of the experiences that people with disabilities are having when they are recipients of these services? So, if we look at the critical characteristics of, we call them HCBS outcome measures. These are some of the things that, we think are critically important. And probably the first one is that these measures are in fact person-centered. Okay, and I would suggest that most of the measures that we're currently using are not. They don't ask people whether they are experiencing the social relationships they desire to experience. They ask people about how many friends do you have. Well, for Tim, having 2 good friends may be sufficient for him to really experience himself as being of the community, to get sufficient social supports. For me, I might need 5 friends to have that same experience. And most of our current measures do not do that. We want them to be feasible and usable. We want those measures to be able to drive an improvement of services. And we want them to focus on the outcomes which are most important to people with disabilities. As we've gone into this 5-year project, one of the things that we constantly keep telling ourselves is, nothing about us without us. We want them to be valid. We want them to be kind of valid in a social way, in a content way, and, to really embody all those other aspects of validity that we talk about in measurement. We want them to be sensitive to change over time, but even though these are all very kind of important aspects or characteristics of outcome measures, we really want to make sure that, these measures drive an improvement of services. Because we know that while the home and community-based services we're currently providing to people with disabilities in the United States are an improvement over, obviously an improvement over what they experienced in institutions, and even what they experienced a decade ago. We have a long way to go before we're providing a set of supports and services that meets everybody's needs. So what we've done, and I think what we want to do today, is focus on the process that we are trying to employ to really improve measurement in this area. Is we propose and we're funded by our Administration on Community Living and our National Institute on Disability and Independent Living Research to do 5 years of kind of measurement improvement research in this area. And there are 6 different studies that we are conducting in order to kind of move through this process, and we hope end up with a set of measures that are better and that can allow us to more effectively deliver services to people with disabilities that help them to achieve the outcomes in life that they desire. We're going to talk today about kind of study 1 and study 2. The other studies, Rnata will talk about kind of in a very brief format because we haven't gotten there yet. And our notion is, unless we can really do a good job with these first 2 studies, studies 3 through 6 don't make any difference. So, we were charged with kind of starting out with a given. Okay, and that is starting out with a given. Okay, with a framework that has been developed by a group in Washington called the National Quality Forum. Okay, it's a fancy term for a bunch of experts who got together and said, we're going to determine what we think are the most important outcomes for people with disability to achieve and therefore for us to measure. And the most important outcomes that we should be measuring within the home and community-based service system. Now, this group, and I'll describe this group to you a little bit more in a minute, came up with what they call 11 broad domains that they thought were most important to measure. And they include things like control and choice over one's life, and the services one gets and receives, a respect and a support for human and legal rights, community inclusion, holistic health and functioning. This workforce area has to do with having a stable workforce, people who provide you with supports. Caregiver support. In the United States, over 50% of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who are adults receive supports from their family members. They are not in community residential programs, but they're actually living home with mom and dad and siblings. Person-centered planning and service coordination. You know, are we planning for services and delivering services in a way that truly is person-centered? Outcomes having to do with service delivery and effectiveness. You know, somebody needs new services. Do they get those services within a reasonable amount of time, within a short period of time? Are we delivering services in an equitable manner? You know, does where one live, does the color of one's skin, one's ethnic group membership, one's primary language have an impact on the services he or she receives? Then there are a couple of other things that focus on system performance and accountability. You know, are we collecting data that allows systems to be held accountable? And finally, to what degree is this entire system, at a local level, at a state level, at a national level, really involving consumers, people who receive home and community-based services and supports, in system development? In other words, are we going to people with disabilities and allowing them to drive the services and supports that we receive? Now, within each of these broad areas, there are a whole number of sub-areas, they're called subdomains, which this National Quality Forum said, we think these are important to measure. I'm not going to go over these because we'll share the slides with you, and in essence, they're not that important with respect to the 45 minutes we have to describe the process that we are using here. What's most important for you to understand is that this group of experts didn't think it was important to socially validate this framework for home and community-based service outcome measurement with the people who are receiving the services. You know, it was a group of people who sat in Washington for 3 days, all of whom had MDs and PhDs after their names, who said, we think we know what's most important for people with disabilities to receive for services, and we think we know the outcomes that are most important for them to receive. And this just wasn't a group of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. This was a much broader group of people with disabilities. People with physical disabilities, people with traumatic brain injury, people with psychiatric disability, people with, you know, all sorts of different disabilities, including age-related disabilities. So what we thought is that we can't ignore the fact that we haven't yet kind of really taken this framework to people and asked them, does this make sense to you? Is this the most important stuff to measure? And just as important, if we use this framework, are we measuring the things that people from different stakeholder groups think are important and people from different disability groups think are important? You know, I mean, I'm not sure whether the outcomes that people with physical disabilities think are most important to measure are the same as people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or people with traumatic brain injury, or people with age-related disabilities. So what we felt is that we first have to go out to people and kind of gain the input of critical stakeholders. And so we used a process which I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing, called participatory planning and decision making. We went out and we presented this model to groups of stakeholders and then asked them to critique this model, to tell us, what do you think we should retain in this model? You know, what do you think is good? What do you think is important to you? And what do you think is not important? And we can toss that stuff out because this model is not in its final form. And so we went and conducted a series of 58 of these groups across the United States, on the West Coast, on the East Coast, in the southern states, in the Midwestern states. And we tried to get the input of as many people with disabilities, it was over 300 individuals, and other stakeholder groups as we could using this participatory planning and decision-making process. In essence, it is a focus group with numbers. Okay, we get people's input, we get people's ideas as to how they think this framework could be improved, and then we take those ideas and have them rate the importance of each of them on a 0 to 100 point scale. We want to know, what do you think is most important to measure to provide you with home and community-based services that meet your needs, that are person-centered, okay, and that essentially allow you to achieve the outcomes in life that you want. We're also interested in kind of figuring out whether different stakeholder groups have kind of consensus as to what the most important things to measure were, whether there were differences between those groups. We presently went into this thinking that, honestly, there might be some core things that all the groups think are important, but gosh, having physical accessibility to, let's say, a community center is probably going to be a little bit more important for somebody who uses a wheelchair than somebody who doesn't have to worry about there being steps to get into the community center. Having a healthcare center that has a bed that can be lowered so that you don't have to be lifted out of your wheelchair, to be placed on an exam table is probably going to have a different level of importance for somebody who uses a wheelchair than somebody who doesn't. So we wanted to know whether these stakeholder groups agreed that those domains and subdomains outlined by this expert group, were the most important things to measure. And so what we did after these groups is we took a look at these importance weightings. And across the groups, we were able to find that there were some of these broad areas or domains that they considered to be more important to measure than others. Okay, this is just kind of highlighting the work that we're doing. Okay, the ones they thought were most important were really getting the system to measure well person-centered planning and service coordination. And that has to do with not just the fact that we create person-centered plans for people, but whether those plans were actually implemented in a person-centered fashion. So did people receive person-centered services? They wanted us to look at service delivery and effectiveness. If I need a support, do I get that support within a reasonable amount of time, or 6 months after I request it? Am I still being told I'm on a waiting list to get access to these services? Choice and control, a big one. In all the quality of life research that's been done over the last 30 years, having choice and control over one's life is considered to be a very important outcome that is highly valued by people with disabilities. And finally, having my human and legal rights respected. And that involves, not just being free from abuse and getting the care and support you need, but being treated in a respectful manner by the people who provide you with supports. We had a second set of subdomains which people rated to be, for them, of average importance, and then a third set which were viewed as somewhat below average. Okay, that doesn't mean they weren't important, that doesn't mean they weren't viewed as critical, okay, but not as important as those 4 areas kind of at the top of that table. Now, that was really only kind of the first step in our taking a look at the data we have, because we wanted to know whether those stakeholder groups and populations differed and how they prioritized those domains and subdomains. And we found that there was actually a bit more consensus than we thought. Where we found there to be outliers, typically among the stakeholder groups, was that family members tended to view things of being of a different level of importance and different things as being more important or less important than persons with disabilities and the people who provided them with supports. But in essence, we found a much higher level of consensus than we thought we would. So what do? We found some good evidence, we think, of the social validity of the framework, but we also found that there were things that people with disabilities, especially people with disabilities, but also other stakeholders, thought were missing from the framework. Okay, in the US, access to a lot of personal outcomes that people with disabilities want in life are dependent upon whether they have transportation to get to where they need to go to achieve those outcomes. Okay, so people said, you need to include transportation in this framework because it's critical. If I don't have transportation, I can't be included in the community. I can't spend time with the people I want to spend. So I need transportation when and where I need it in a way that's accessible, in a manner that's safe. Employment. Okay, employment within the model that was provided to us kind of as a starting point was kind of embedded 2 or 3 levels deep in this broad subdomain called community inclusion. And what we heard from the people with disabilities who we spoke with is, no, darn it, employment is a critical outcome for me. I want to be employed. I want to be able to contribute to my community. I want to be a taxpayer, okay? And right now, the service system is providing me with disincentives for being employed. Because if I'm employed more than 15 hours a week, I lose so many of my home and community service benefits that it makes absolutely no sense for me to push my employer to provide me with more hours. But you know something? I want more hours. I want to be employed in a way that I'm thinking that I'm making a valuable contribution to society. And then in the United States, one of the critical pieces that we have, problems with our care system, is that staff turnover. The average person who's providing home and community-based services to people with disabilities stays in their position 6 to 9 months. Within a 1-year period of time, if you have 4 people providing you with supports, that entire staff may change over. So how do we expect to provide person-centered supports if we have people providing us with supports who don't know us, who don't know us as an individual, who don't know what our preferences are, our desired life outcomes? So in a nutshell, that was our first study, okay? We learned a lot from it, and we're taking this information and tweaking this framework that the experts developed to, we think, make it better reflect the outcomes that people with disabilities and their family members really think are most important to measure. I'm going to turn things over now to Rnata, who's going to talk about the second piece of our research, which is a process in which we have kind of taken a look at what's currently out there as measurement tools, and in a sense, critiqued what they do.
So in this little transition, I just, we have transitioned from the presentations in the morning that they're very focused on the qualitative experience of an individual with a disability. I'm sort of feeling this, people are thinking, so how does this relate to some of this very quantitative measurement, right? And so that's something we really struggle with, because we, as Brian indicated at the beginning, there is a high stake to what we are trying to do because of the large expenditure in the system, and yet we want to honor the individual experiences, and it's not an easy task. Okay, so then this is just kind of to give you the scope. We have research assistants who work with us who have helped us review 130, now it's more than that, now it's about 130 instruments that exist within the US that measure outcomes for people with disabilities. So you can just see, if you're ever thinking of developing something new, please don't start from scratch. Look at other things that exist, because you don't want to reinvent the wheel. With that said, many of these assessment tools are not very good, so there is kind of a balance of not reinventing the wheel and yet critically examining what is out there. Again, our research assistants have coded all of the questions within these instruments, and the purpose is not just some futile exercise to give them work to do. This is really to look at the quality of the questions that are being asked to the individual with a disability or a family member or a provider. So that's the point of all this. So this is to just give you an example. When Brian showed the National Quality Forum with the different domains that might be and are important for people with disabilities, compared to the instruments that exist within the US, how do they overlap with what people see as important? So you can see, for example, that I just point out one of the controversial ones. Under community inclusion, you can see there are many questions that these instruments address under community inclusion. But do you think these questions really address community inclusion? Is it easy to measure community inclusion?
Give an example.
Absolutely. So as I'm seeing the nodding and not nodding of your heads, is that it is not an easy task. So an instrument I work with all the time is the National Core Indicators Survey. Tim knows the instrument, Brian works with it as well. Some of the questions in that instrument that tend to be repetitive are, how many times in the last month have you gone to a coffee shop? How many times in the last month have you gone to the gym? How many times in the last month have you gone to a place of worship? Now, these questions are fine, except that can we really call them community inclusion, right? And so one of our tasks, and some of these areas are not as difficult to conceptualize, is to really, beyond doing a qualitative work, where we can really have a dialogue with a person, what it means to them, is to somehow quantify what it means to be included in a community. And what people have told us in the groups that Brian was describing, well, it's about engagement, feeling that we are contributing to society, that there is reciprocity of relationships. And so that's something we are trying to tackle within this measurement system. And we are in the second year of the study, and that's really, we are in thick of defining some of these constructs that are so personal to people and yet so diverse across people and different disabilities, and that is extremely challenging. I don't think this is really interesting. So one of the things that we are doing, and I'll go back to this slide because that kind of illustrates. So for every single of these domains and subdomains that were deemed as important in the diagram that Brian showed, we are trying to go into literature, into some theory to see what really conceptualizes human and legal rights, whatever these are, choice and control, and other aspects of home and community-based services, and then trying to find good questions within the 130 instruments we have coded to match them best to the theory and to what people have been telling us. Now, as you can see, we may have 200 questions under community inclusion, but maybe 8 of them are good questions. And the 8 questions are missing a whole aspect of other types of inclusion that is not covered. So then we are collaborating with Temple University in the US to develop some new questions to cover some of these gaps. So that's the really the purpose of this particular study that I was describing. So
what did I stand for?
Okay, that in essence tells you that of all the questions that are asked in all these instruments, 130 plus instruments, that focus on evaluating the impact of home and community-based services, that 23% of the questions focus on community inclusion. Doesn't mean they're good questions,
it's
but
just
23%.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
look at some of those up on the top. Equity. They don't ask questions about equity. Consumer leadership and system development. You know, I mean, our organizations that provide these services, going to people with disabilities and asking them, what do you want these supports to be like? We're not doing it. We're not asking people questions about that. So
And if we are, the questions are really good. Yeah, so the quantity versus quality, and I think that's been the discussion for the whole day today, is some of the reconciling the narratives of people that are critical with the number of people that need to be served. So that's something to think about. So this is our list that we have spent a year and a half, you know, with the 56 or 58 groups all over the country, and then other input of experts on our team and also on our National Advisory Board to pick the subdomains that most matter to people as far as concepts to measure, to go back to the human community-based services and how much is being spent in our country to really serve people with disabilities. And so you can just look at this list, you know, from person choices and goals, transportation, that was one of the new ones that was added to the existing framework, choice of services, meaningful activity, person's needs and goals realized, self-direction, social connectedness and relationships, freedom from abuse and negative neglect, employment and workforce were added to the framework, person-centered planning, access to resources, and the last one was specifically pointed out to us by another expert, which is fluctuation of capacity, and that relates to people with psychiatric disabilities and also sometimes people with traumatic brain injury, where you have a certain need at a certain point in time and then it changes. Then it changes again. It's not like, you know, sometimes people with intellectual disabilities tend to have more stable features.
Ranatta, just a question. When you look at the domain, I understand your wish is in the process of building a scale to represent these domains. Is the wish for this scale to be usable for all disability groups?
That
So
is the
just
wish of the people who
Yes.
are driving this,
Right.
which is the Center for Medicaid Services. One of the things that we should say is that we are constantly butting heads with these individuals because they tend to come from medical and rehabilitation backgrounds. What they're used to is designing assessment systems or measurement tools that count things like how many UTIs have you had, or how many pressure ulcers have you had in the last, urinary tract infections, how many pressure ulcers have you experienced, how many falls have you had in the last 6 months, and we're constantly arguing them about the fact that, well, okay, those are easy things to count, okay, but you can't count community inclusion. Okay, you need to look at it with much more nuance, with much more understanding that it's going to vary from person to person. One of our most effective self-advocates in the U.S. is a gentleman named Ari Neiman. And Ari is from California, and Ari has an autism spectrum disorder. You know, and he pointed out to us that, do you guys realize that under all this stuff on social connected and relationships, there isn't one question that focuses on people getting together via the web, via the internet, and that, he said, for many of the people who I represent as an advocate, that's a much more comfortable way. And telling me that, oh, you've got to be more included in the community, I need to take you out to another coffee shop and a cafe, is not necessarily something which is contributing positively to my life.
Right, so to answer your question, it's an empirical sort of discovery whether we can apply these measures across disabilities, or, you know, there will be some measures that we probably can, some we cannot, so we, you know, we'll see.
In the research seminar that I teach, we tried to measure, the students had to measure community inclusion in one way or the other, and we adapted the measure by Salzer.
Mark Salzer? Yeah, that's our partner on the ground.
Mark is one of our partners.
Yeah, so we work very
find
closely.
things alike. But many have had many difficulties really because of the counting system.
Right.
How do you take all these items and then make them something that makes sense
We
together?
aren't going to count them.
Right, but we are going to count some things.
Something.
But we
Not
are,
all.
you know, so what I want to, there are two things I want to do. Well, I guess it's not here. One is, I just want to tell you in one slide what is sort of the big goal, and then if we have 5 minutes just to ask you about, in relation to this framework, what you think in Israel might come to the top in those domains. So it's related to Shirley's question. We want eventually, this will be in a year or in a year and a half, to collect data on the best questions that we have found in the existing instruments and the questions that are developed in addition to cover some of these main domains, especially those that are really difficult to measure, and to examine them for the basic psychometric properties of assessments, which is reliability, validity, measure discrimination, and sensitivity to change. We have 1,000 people, so it's going to be a big endeavor. Now, one thing is the sensitivity to change is the big question mark. Because what that means is, how can we know what to expect for an outcome to improve, for example? So what does it mean to be better socially included, you know, for your son versus for somebody else's child with a disability, total different disability? How can we A, compare that outcome, and B, how can we assess if the person is making progress? So that's the most challenging characteristics for us, I think, in this endeavor. The reliability, validity, you know, that's something that we know how to do. So with that, I'm going to put up this back. Do you think in Israel, and I know we don't have much time to ponder this, but do you think some of these would be as important for your society, or would there be some things that are not on this list that are glaring? Anything that you would think you would want to measure with the population of people with disabilities?
In regards, by the way, to specific service, or in general, or in terms of our perceptions towards life, or whatever?
Right, so in this particular project, we are measuring the home and community-based service effectiveness, but of course, it can't be totally isolated from what you see as important. Yeah.
I think that we have to take into consideration the cultural background of the person. Because it's very hard to answer this question without referring to subgroups within the Israeli society. It depends if I live in the city, if I live in a peripheral area.
That is true.
So it should be sensitive to culture.
To culture, yes. Yeah, that's a very good point.
Yes.
So I think some services, such as never mind. So some services, such as home dialysis, home IV, services that are supposed to let the people continue with their normal life would be measured by how well they do so. Because if the service is given every day between 8 in the morning and 1, and you have to sit at home and wait for it, it would probably make it harder for you to go to work every day. So sometimes the whole point of the service doesn't work as well as it should be because of not thinking through it.
Right, and that's the domain of service delivery and effectiveness. I think you're referring to that. It interestingly didn't come up to our top 13. But again, it's not saying that it's not important. It's just that where the biggest gaps are for us to measure at this time in the U.S. So I think,
Well, this would probably be a problem for people who want to go out of their house and have a very, very, I don't know, many responsibilities outside of their homes. And that is probably more for some disabilities and not for others.
No, you're right. I mean, I totally agree with that. I'm sorry.
Maybe it's not just Israel or US or Canada, but I think that for people with chronic illness, with a disability that is changing according to the condition of the body, this might be a trouble to measure, because you can need something for a month, something for 2 months, then you have remission, then you have so it's changing to measure
And
at
that's
one point.
one of our colleagues put this up for us, the fluctuation of capacity. That was the domain that was added because exactly of the point that you're making. Yeah. Yes, you have a question?
Earlier on you brushed very quickly over validity, and then you said, Brian, that this is not numbers. So how are we looking at validity in this type of research, in your terms?
I think that the first thing was to validate the model itself with people with disabilities and to see across the disability groups, are they saying that, yeah, this makes sense to us?
Oh, that's
okay.
validity.
Yeah, and that's the first step. On the other hand, what we know is even some of the best tools that are out there now being used, and we have one tool called the National Core Indicators that is being used in 40 states. Okay, one version of it has some pretty decent validity and reliability data. Another version, which is used quite often, and many of the tools that are currently used, we don't know whether they are measuring these constructs in a valid, reliable way. When research has been done, it's been done on the entire instrument. So we can say that if we ask these 90 questions, we know that overall, if we ask them today and then we ask them 2 weeks later, the correlation between time 1 and time 2 is 0.83, okay? On the other hand, we don't know whether that's the same correlation we would get if we just asked those questions about community inclusion at time 1 and time 2. So there's a lot of research which is yet to be done to really know whether these instruments are psychometrically sound.
So just to add to that, that's why we are collecting data on 1,000 participants, and we do have to, most of these questions are basically on a Likert scale, unfortunately. We do realize the shortcoming of this, so we will be counting things and doing quantitative data analysis. Yeah.
Really interesting work, challenging. Glad that you know me. problems with some of the instruments has been the use of sort of proxy data and how do you get a voice to folks with severe intellectual disabilities and stuff. So I wonder how do you kind of address that problem?
So some of the tools in that list of 130 are observational tools. We will be taking, and again, we are just in the middle of all this, we'll be taking some of the approaches of the classic Likert type scales, some observational tools, another tool, you know, the Wisconsin tool, the peonies, for example. So we'll have slightly different formats to make sure that we do not exclude people with the most severe disabilities, because that's what we fight against all our work career. So that's a very important point.
That being said, I'm wondering if Tamara, one other thing I think that has to do, I guess, with Israel and the way it works is one thing that isn't in the list, and I think because it does work very differently in the States, has to do with budgets that are given to families and children or whatever it is with disabilities. If we're talking about, let's say, power wheelchair or other things that have to do with their disabilities that are going to affect many of these things, and I think it does work differently Medicaid-wise. By care, it's the Ministry of Health, it may be something from the Ministry of Education, it may have to do with national health. So there's something there also that I think has to do with Israel policy that's a bit different and may come into one of the top regarding supports. I'm saying, like, if we want inclusion or if we want to be able to go anywhere, or does the family have a car that's accessible and can take the power wheelchair? Do they have the money to pay for it? And if not, who's going to pay for that gap? Or if it's a power wheelchair, if it's other technology the child needs to communicate or otherwise. So that's definitely something.
Right, and for us it's the same, because we have multiple sources of funding for people with disabilities. And so, I mean, luckily, and I don't know how it is here, but in the US, the community of researchers have the power to influence policy, which is a really nice feature about the US that, coming from the Czech Republic, was very foreign to me. And so we do have ways to influence policy, and we work with policymakers directly with our research results, which is a privilege to be able to inform that. So I don't know if you know what you are referring to, but I'm sure that policy-wise between countries there will be some differences.
I have a question about education that was related to animal parts, because you talked about employment. I was wondering if education was part of access to resources, if it's sub-domain.
Yes.
Education is included in some of these areas, but this is the framework itself, and the funding agency is basically restricted us to looking at those services and supports that occur outside of the educational system, in the same way that we also can't, because of the limitations that's been put on this work, look at healthcare services. That's considered to be kind of a separate thing in the United States, kind of a separate silo. And oftentimes, even though they are so closely intertwined, okay, it's like, nope, can't ask questions about that because that's not part of home and community-based service.
Right, but one thing where education does come in, it's not for the person with disability, but for the caregiver. So there were questions we asked about how important is it for caregivers to get training and build their skills if they want.
It also comes in under meaningful community activity. That includes, you know, education, recreation, leisure activity, and a number of different things. And that education is looked at broadly. It could be personal education. I want to, let's say, take part in a yoga class or an exercise class. I want to go to a community college. To, you know, I want to get my doctorate in disability studies. So that's included there, and one of the arguments that we've had is that that's such an important aspect of community inclusion, whether tool developers, when they see this meaningful activity, are going to give enough attention to developing and validating questions in some of these areas. It's one of the reasons why people with disabilities told us to pull employment out and look at that as a totally separate category, because it was buried within meaningful activity.
We are out of
Yes, I think so.
And we are also measured by the time we give to break time. And for lunch. So thank you very much for joining you. In terms of break, we have until
1:45. I will be bringing, if you can remove any laptop or expensive equipment, we will be bringing lunch to the table. I think we'll have about 1:45 break.